Hey, I'm John Orgill. Welcome to my shop. Today I'm going to build a small keepsake box with hand-cut half-blind dovetails. I hope you'll stick around and see how it comes together. I've got a fair amount of scrap lumber lying around my shop, and so I decided to use some of it for this project. I had a piece of cherry that I wasn't totally in love with, but this is a scrap project, right? I also had a bunch of maple left over from another project. The first step was to kind of get some measurements and figure out how big I wanted the box to be. It's going to end up being roughly 5.5 inches wide, 10 inches long, and about 3 inches tall. For the top and bottom pieces, I decided to resaw a couple of the pieces of maple. This is a great little trick. You can use your finger as an edge guide and quickly find the center of a board. It's great for things that don't have to be super precise. The next step is to head over to the bandsaw and resaw that board so that I can book match it. This is a great way to avoid wasting lumber and creates a really nice look as well. It's always fun to see what's on the inside of a board, and this one turned out really nice. The next step in the process is to head over to the jointer. I have taken on kind of a hybrid approach when it comes to my woodworking. I just feel like doing it all by hand takes too long, and I don't get enough time to actually complete any projects when I do it that way. The jointer will give me one flat face, and I can then use that face and push it up against the fence to get a nice square edge. I started by milling the piece of cherry that I had, and then went on and milled up the maple as well. It's really important to pay attention to which way the grain is going in the piece of wood that you're milling. You also have to understand which way the blade is spinning in the machine so that you don't end up getting a lot of tear out. Next, I moved over to the planer. I started again with that piece of cherry since it's a lot thicker than the maple. Whenever you're milling lumber, if you can, it's good to try and take an even amount from both sides, and that will help minimize the possibility of the movement of wood after it's exposed to the air. It's also a good idea to let it sit for a while after you mill it and leave a little bit of extra thickness on there so that you can mill it down again if it moves at all. Once it was all milled up, I was able to look at it and decide which way I wanted the grain to be oriented. In this case, it looks like there's a bit of a cathedral there. On this panel, I didn't like the way it was at first, so I flipped it around and ended up using more of the straight grain. I flipped that first panel around as well. Typically, that straighter grain is going to be a lot more stable and not tend to move as much. These are the side pieces, and they're going to get ripped down, and I will use more of the straight grain from them as well. The next step in this process is to joint the boards so there's no gap when I join the boards together. And if you notice right there, I flipped the boards over so that the joint that I want to put together is face down on my bench, which is flat. I can then put it in my vise and use a hand plane to make sure that the joint is nice and straight. By jointing both boards together at the same time, I can actually compensate for any error that there may be as I hand plane the joint. Next, I glue the panel together. I like to spread the glue with my finger, make sure that I get a nice even coat across both joints. A lot of times I see people apply so much pressure with their clamps that they squeeze all of the glue out of the joint. So you want to be careful not to overdo it, but you do want to make sure you get a nice bead of squeeze out coming through the seam. Next, I began laying out the width of the cherry. I used a wheel marking gauge in order to mark that off, and then followed up with a pencil so that I'd be able to see the line a little better. Throughout this video, you're going to see me use a square to make sure that all the edges are square to each other. That's very important when it comes to making joinery that ends up fitting well. Here I'm using my number 7 jointer to straighten the edge of the maple. And I'll check that with a square to make sure that I've got a nice square edge. I mark the face with a pencil with a face mark, and then the corresponding square edge with an edge mark so that I can always reference from those two surfaces. So obviously a lot of different methods that you can use to rip stock. Here I'm using a handsaw. Obviously a table saw would work great as well. Another option that I really like is the scrub plane. The handsaw sometimes can take a while, especially with a really long rip. But if you got something shorter like this, a scrub plane can make quick work of it. After I've gotten the bulk of the material off with the scrub plane, I then move back to the jointer so that I can straighten the edge. This is a nice little trick that I use to make sure that both ends of the board are the same width. If I just turn one around and make sure that they're flush on each end, both directions, I'll know that they're the same width on both ends. This is an example of a time where the grain may not be super easy to read. If you look closely at that grain, it looks like it's moving uphill, which would typically be the way that I would want to plane to get a nice smooth cut. In this case, you can tell right away it kind of had a tough time starting there, and it was just really tearing out. I ended up turning the board around, and it looks like I'm planing the wrong direction based on the grain there, but it was a much, much smoother cut. I'll go back to the jointer again on this cherry to make sure that it's a nice, straight, smooth edge. After I've got the boards trimmed to width, it's time to cross-cut them to length. I start by making sure that I've got a nice square end using the shooting board. Again, it's super important that all of these joints end up being nice and square if you're going to have a nice looking box at the end of this. I measure over for the length and mark it with a pencil. This is just a rough cut, and I'll trim it up again on the shooting board once I'm done. It's really important when you're planing end grain that the blade be nice and sharp. So I took an opportunity here to sharpen the blade on my plane. In this video I'm using a diamond plate. That's a piece of steel that's coated with a bunch of diamonds, and use a little bit of water with soap in it to help lubricate the particles and float them off. I'm looking for the primary bevel, and then I raise up just a little bit more. I'll spend a few seconds here sharpening until I can feel a small burr on the back side of the blade. And that burr didn't quite make it all the way across the back of the blade, so I'm going to try again for a few more seconds. Once I've got a burr all the way across the blade, then I'll know that I'm done sharpening. I just flip it over and spend a few seconds on the back of the blade working that burr off. I always try to drop the back of the blade instead of pick it up to avoid rounding over that edge that I just sharpened. I like to make sure that I get the blade nice and clean and dry so that it doesn't rust, and then I'll put it back together. The closer I can get that chip breaker to the edge of the blade, the better cut I will get, but it will also mean that I'll have to push a little bit harder to get it through the wood. What I'm doing here is trying to make sure that the blade is parallel to the sole of the plane so that I get an even cut. I'm projecting the blade just far enough that I can see a little shadow, and I'm able to adjust it that way. Spending just that little time sharpening resulted in a much cleaner cut and made it a lot easier to push the plane through the wood. Making sure that these boards are all the same size is very important, again, to make sure I have a square box. Your fingers are really sensitive and can feel down to the thousandths of an inch. All it took was a couple shavings and then I was there. I repeated the process again on the maple, again trying to make sure that everything was square and the same length. Once the stock was all prepped, I was able to lay it out and get an idea what this box is going to look like. In my next video, I'll walk you through the process of laying out, cutting, and fitting hand-cut half-blind dovetails. If you want to be notified when that next video comes out, make sure you subscribe and hit that bell. Thanks for watching.